Welcome to the debate here on France 24. I'm Mark Owen. Israel is now seriously considering what its next move should be regarding the plan named Peace to Prosperity. Other words, the Trump Plan for Peace in the Middle East. Formally unveiled in Washington back in January, you recall it was in the presence of Benjamin Netanyahu. No Palestinians were invited to the event. There are many reasons why Netanyahu is very much in favor of this plan, and many reasons why the Palestinians are dead set against it. Annexation of illegal Israeli settlements on the West Bank, of course, is one of those reasons. Think of the Jordan Valley and some 130 settlements across the West Bank. Add to that a call to disarm, recognition of Israel as a Hebrew or Jewish state. Things that have been already condemned by others such as the EU. If Israel goes ahead with this annexation, some people are predicting it could lead to an escalation of any kind of conflict situation. We're here to discuss the issues related to Peace to Prosperity, this Trump plan for the Middle East. We have, in no order of preference, so all the voices here are equal and equally important. In London, we're joined by Hugh Lovett, Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hugh, thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
In Tel Aviv, Emmanuel Navon, who's Professor of International Relations at the Tel Aviv University and Senior Fellow at the Coelet Policy Forum. Emmanuel, thanks for being with us.
Good to be here.
In Amman, Jordan, Duad Kutab, who's a Palestinian journalist and columnist and former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton. Thanks for being with us, sir.
Thank you.
And in Washington, D.C., David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Program on Arab-Israeli Relations at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. David, thanks for joining us.
Delighted.
Before I let our panelists loose on this issue, let's take a look at this report.
Following months of talks, the administrations of Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump are yet to agree on the map spelling out exactly which parts of this narrow, hilly region will be annexed by Israel. And as the discussions continue with the White House envoy and the US ambassador, it's looking like the July the 1st start date will be missed.
דיברתי על שאלת הריבונות שאנחנו עובדים עליה בימים אלה ונמשיך לעבוד עליה בימים הקרובים.
The West Bank has been under Israeli control for more than half a century. By most interpretations of international law, Israeli settlements on it are deemed illegal. Netanyahu desperately wishes to be the leader who makes Israel's claim to the territories permanent, along with the strategically important Jordan Valley. Donald Trump's pro-Israel administration has given him the unique opportunity to pursue this, but the clock is ticking, as Netanyahu knows the US president could be out of office within months if he fails to secure re-election. The US, meanwhile, wants Israeli politicians to agree between themselves where the map should be drawn, but for Netanyahu's coalition partner Benny Gantz, the annexation is not a priority during the global pandemic.
וביחד נתמודד עם ההשלכות הכלכליות והחברתיות של התופעה הרפואית הזו. מה שאינו קשור בקורונה יחכה לימים של אחרי הווירוס.
While the annexation is defended by Netanyahu on security and religious grounds, it will also cause major problems for Israel. It will no doubt spark renewed violence from those who see the West Bank as the heart of a future Palestinian state. It will also cause diplomatic issues around the world, as aside from the Trump administration, almost everyone, including the United Nations, the Arab League and the European Union, are against it.
That report there by Alexander Okot. Let's bring in our panel, starting with Hugh Lovett in London at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hugh, can you tell us what you think the atmosphere in the Jordan Valley might be like right now?
So the atmosphere in the Jordan Valley and elsewhere in the West Bank, I think at a popular level, we haven't seen widespread popular Palestinian mobilization against the prospect of formal annexation. We saw some Fatah-led protests in the Jordan Valley a few days ago, but we really haven't seen popular anger. Now, I wouldn't take that to mean that Palestinians are fine with what's happening, but rather I think for many Palestinians, there's a sense that the transition from de facto annexation to de jure annexation won't immediately impact their lives. And so I think that I think there's a more general loss of hope and hope that actually there can be any form of peace process that could result in a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. So I think the sense of hopelessness will ultimately translate, with time into a new set of Palestinian strategies, which may be, predicated on the demand for equal rights with Israelis in one state.
So a sense of resigned pessimism, perhaps. Hugh, thank you for now. Let's go to Tel Aviv and Emmanuel Navon from the Tel Aviv University and the Coalesce Policy Forum. Emmanuel, the situation, as you see, I mean, today Netanyahu had promised that there'd be some move. He announced that back in May. Were you expecting some kind of move into the West Bank?
No, I wasn't, because as you know, politicians are different before and after elections, and Netanyahu spoke a lot about annexation before the last elections, but we're now after the elections. So I don't think he has any reason really to move on with such annexation, and that's why nothing happened today. I personally was not surprised. When President Trump announced his plan in January, Netanyahu wanted to tell his voters that he would annex some of the territories which the Trump plan was basically attributing to Israel. But after the elections, he has too many constraints on him, not only domestically, but also internationally. And by the way, Netanyahu altogether has been prime minister for 14 years, if you take into account his first stint between 96 and 99. And he has never promoted annexation, and whenever there was pressure on him to move on with some kind of partial annexation, his standard answer was, why do I need this headache when we are building on the ground? I don't need the attention of the international community. And my guess is that his basic position hasn't really changed. The political circumstances have changed, but as I said, we're now after the election, which means it's a different world as far as politicians are concerned.
So one word while campaigning, one word when in power, and the truth lies somewhere in between, which is something that's fairly common with many politicians, as you point out. Let's bring in our Palestinian guest for some comment on this one. Joining us from Amman, Duad Kutab. We heard from Hugh Lovett at the start of this discussion about a sense that perhaps there is a sort of pessimistic air about what's going on amongst Palestinians. Would you agree with that? Would you think Palestinians are kind of worn down by what's happening?
Well, Palestinians feel, as always, isolated. The Israelis negotiate between themselves, and at best they negotiate with the Americans about the future of the Palestinian areas. So it's very disheartening to see that everybody's negotiating, drawing maps and playing, monopoly games with our land and with our future. And so, yes, people are very upset and disappointed and disgusted, actually, because, while America, they're fighting against racism and saying, people should listen to what blacks say. Nobody asked what the Palestinians think. They want to know what Gantz thinks. They want to know what Netanyahu thinks. They want to know what Jared Kushner thinks. But nobody wants to know what the Palestinians think. And it's their land.
Duad Kutab, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back to you very shortly. Let's go to Washington, D.C. David Makovsky waiting for us there. David, in terms of what you're hearing there, the Palestinians are very clearly were cut out of any negotiation here. Would you agree that their points of view, their feelings weren't taken into consideration at all?
Look, the problem here goes back to 2017, that once the Trump administration moved this embassy to Jerusalem, the Palestinians have boycotted the administration. There's no talks officially between the Trump administration and the Palestinians. The Palestinians think the U.S. is illegitimate. That's how they see this administration. There's no doubt, I think, that if the Palestinians wanted to stop it, they could say, we'll offer a counteroffer to the Trump plan. I'm not here to advocate this way or that way at all. I'm just, as an analyst, I see that that the Palestinians could stop this whole process by saying, we're here with a counteroffer. But they see if we do a counteroffer, we're ending our boycott from 2017. And therefore, we're legitimizing Trump, and therefore we don't want to legitimize Trump, so we're not going to do a counteroffer. And therefore, it's almost, the optic of the U.S. talking only to Israel is what looks like a French 24 because Palestinians have taken themselves out. Now, I understand their feelings since 2017, but it didn't start here. It's really about a Palestinian boycott.
But David, Palestinians did make a counteroffer. The problem is that the Americans insist, and the Israelis, that we have to have talks based on the Trump plan, which we weren't involved in. Come on, I mean, the last talks that we had under Obama and John Kerry, it was the Israelis who blew up the talks. And the Russians are offering to make talks. The UN is making talks. The Quartet is saying, and everybody says, no, the Israelis say only under the Israeli and American plan. It's an Israeli plan read in America. And that's the only plan that we're allowed to talk under. That's the basis of the talks. How can you have talks when you're not involved in the actual basis of the talks?
Daoud, first of all, I love you. You're a very respected analyst, and I read what you write. I could just say, as someone who was on the Kerry team, that's not what happened. What happened was that Abbas told the president on March 17, 2014, I'll get back to you within a week with this offer, and he never got back to us. That's the story. It wasn't the Israelis who blew it up. My point is, we got to get the Israelis and Palestinians together.
David, John Kerry, not me. It was John Kerry who said that.
No, well, I could just tell you, as someone who was on the team, that was the last move, was March 17. I don't want to relive the past. I know for our viewers, they don't care. But my point is, there's no substitute for the Israelis and the Palestinians talking to each other. That's why I'm against the annexation. I think it's wrong, and I think that the parties themselves have to deal with it. But, you know, despite what Mark said in his opener, it's not that the Palestinians weren't invited. The Palestinians refused to talk to this administration. That's the reality. And Daoud, I think you agree with me on this.
Yes, they talked before. They had many meetings, and everything they said was thrown in the garbage. And then they moved the embassy. Of course, that you know, everybody says Palestinians and Israelis must not take any decision that will affect the final status. And the Americans, who have nothing to do with this, they're the ones who played and got involved, and they carried the Israeli bag. That's what messed it up.
Look, I do think the U.S. should have gotten much more in return for it, but I see that different than this, because what America does with America's buildings, it's one thing. It could have extracted more from Israel. I totally agree with you. This is different, because once you annex the land, then you reduce the incentives for Israel to make concessions later on. And there's no substitute for Israelis and Palestinians negotiating among themselves.
On that, I agree with you.
Okay,
David, thank you very much indeed. And don't hesitate, David, to give us that kind of context, because you said the viewers perhaps aren't interested in it. I think it's fascinating to get that extra insight. So thank you for giving us that added value. Really appreciate it. Can I bring Hugh Lovett in on this next issue? All related, of course. Do you think perhaps this is a plan in its hatching that was one that the Americans, that the Trump administration knew the Palestinians would never, ever go for?
Well, I hope they knew that. And if they thought realistically that the Palestinians could bite, I think that would be particularly troubling, because, you know, just reading the plan and how it comes across, you know that it falls far short of the most minimum Palestinian negotiating position. Now, you could criticize that Palestinian negotiating position if you want, but the point is that negotiations are negotiations. You need both sides at the table. And in the plan, there's very little for the Palestinians to negotiate over, if apart from, you know, what's been called basically the terms of their bankruptcy deal. And I think this is an important point, though. I don't want to wade into the discussion we just had about the past and stuff. But I think the difference with the Trump plan is it's basically imposing a final deal on the Palestinians, rather than what previous American administrations have done, which is framing that deal. And it's, you know, departing from the very basis of the two-state solution. So to David's point about, yes, the Palestinians should present a counter offer. Well, you know, they have, but I think the question is, can they accept the Trump plan as a basis for negotiations, which they can't, and nor can the EU and other members of the Quartet. But also, can the Israelis and the Israeli government actually accept to enter into a process that can lead to a sovereign and independent Palestinian state based on international parameters that we all know, which include, you know, the 1967 borders with land swaps. And I think there's very little to indicate that the Israeli government could actually sign up to those most minimum terms.
Hugh, thank you. Emmanuel Navon, can I bring you in from Tel Aviv? So again, something put on the table here, which the Palestinians would not go for, something that really is in many terms just kind of being seen as something that perhaps is helping Benjamin Netanyahu with his status and with his political issues.
Well, you know, in the short conversation before between David Makovsky and Daoud Kutab, at some point David said, the viewers don't care about the past, but they should care about the past. And also I'd like to respond to what you said about what Israel would be or will not be willing to accept. In fact, there have been already 3 offers on the table that would have basically established a two-state solution around the 1949 armistice lines. And I'm talking about the Clinton parameters in December 2000, the offer of Ehud Olmert in September 2008, and the Kerry plan in February 2014. All 3 proposals, basically, there would have been a Palestinian state with the land swaps on nearly all of the West Bank and all of the Gaza Strip. All proposals were rejected by the Palestinian leadership, and Israel was on record for accepting them. And therefore, that is first of all, setting the record straight. Now, I think we have to realize today that the idea that today a two-state solution would include an Israeli withdrawal to the 1949 armistice lines, a division of Jerusalem, and an immigration of the third generation of Palestinian refugees to Israel, this is just never going to happen. There is a two-state solution which is acceptable to a majority of Israelis, and that is the two-state solution that had been spelled out by Yitzhak Rabin, the late Prime Minister of Israel, before his murder in November 1995. And that was a demilitarized Palestinian state, Israeli sovereignty over the Solomon Blocks and the Jordan Valley, and a united Jerusalem without some of the neighborhoods of northern and eastern Jerusalem. Most Israelis would agree to that. And that is exactly what the Trump plan is talking about. Now, I realize that this is not acceptable to the Palestinians, but they also rejected offers that were much more favorable to them. And I think that basically, if today we have this plan that is at least acceptable to the Israelis, then it would be for the Palestinians to decide if they just want to keep the status quo forever or have a smaller, about 70 or 80% of the West Bank, demilitarized Palestinian state, or just continue with the status quo.
Emmanuel, thank you. Obviously, straight to Amman to get the reaction of Daoud Kutab, the Palestinian journalist and columnist. Daoud, can I just start you off by saying this plan in many ways is kind of united Palestinian points of view, both Fatah and Hamas, clearly.
Well, yeah, it has united Palestinians, and it actually has united the world. The only person who accepts this plan is Netanyahu's Likud party. Not even the Israelis don't accept the annexation, and the Americans don't accept it. Europe doesn't accept it. The Arabs don't accept it. But let me take our friend from Tel Aviv to credit. Olmert, took a napkin and he drew the map of the West Bank. There was never any maps that were presented. Jerusalem, as you said, Professor, was not included in the map. And Mahmoud Abbas does not want to flood Israel with refugees. He said clearly, I was born in Safad and I don't want to go and live in there. I would like to visit. And so you've had the best Palestinian president ever, who is not in favor of flooding Israel with refugees, who's willing to accept a creative solution for Jerusalem. But it has to be done bilaterally. When you do something unilaterally, you don't give the other side a chance to negotiate. If you take land that on a unilateral basis, how can Palestinians take something in return? Will they open the Gaza? Will they create a corridor between Gaza and the West Bank? They're not going to do that. The sovereignty that Rabin talked about, Mahmoud Abbas said, we don't mind having NATO forces on the Jordan Valley. That's fine. But to block off the possibility of Palestinians expanding to the Jordan Valley, to block the possibility of Jordanian Palestinian borders, that is not acceptable by anybody.
Daoud Kutab in Amman, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in David from Washington, David Makovsky of the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. David, with your experience of the past throwing towards the future, how does this get resolved? Is it a question of both sides getting together? It would seem that's the thing that needs to happen, but it seems the least likely thing that could happen.
Look, the point is, none of these, if there was a Venn diagram, what you're hearing from the other guests, between what Netanyahu could accept, what Abbas could accept, that Venn diagram does not overlap on these 5 core issues, which is the borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, mutual recognition. Do you accept the other side's character? And so my view is that, and here I agree with Emmanuel, is that there's been 3 efforts by the United States to try to bring this conflict to an end, 2008, and 2014. And those efforts didn't work. And it wasn't for a lack of trying by the United States. And so the question is it worth it? If the administration would have asked me, I'd say, don't try a fourth time with these guys because the gaps are just too wide. I would rather see that we do something on the ground that would get people to believe again. There's a profound sense of disbelief on the Israeli and Palestinian side. If you look at the polls of Khalil Shikaki in Ramallah, you look at the polls of Tamar Herman in Israel, they point to this sense of disbelief. And I think we have to be more gradual here, but get to the core, visceral fears of the publics on both sides that would at least get us on the road to a solution, because trying to solve all these 5 issues at once have not worked now 3 times. So to me, it is very simple. It is getting at the core fears. On the Palestinian side, their fear is issue of land, which is if Israel keeps building settlements, there won't be much to talk about at a certain point. And that means not building, limiting where you are to areas that it will be Israeli in a way that's commonsensical, but conveys to the Palestinians you're not shutting the door to solving the big 5 issues. And for the Israeli side, it's the fear of terrorism. And do you really accept the other side exists? And that means, in my view, you don't pay relatives of suicide bombers. That doesn't send the message that you want peace, but you're incentivizing violence. I think if we saw concrete steps on an issue that means something to an Israeli public and something to the Palestinian public, we wouldn't see the polling data that now under 50% in both camps believe a 2-state solution is possible. I would like to see practical things that get us on the road, even if we don't reach the destination. If we shoot too high, too fast, my fear is it'll end like the other 3. And I fear like this 4th effort of the Trump plan, all 4 will fail. So I'd rather see something practical that the publics on each side believe is real and meaningful to them. And instead of trying to bridge this Venn diagram that is not bridgeable so long as the leaders are Netanyahu and Abbas.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's get more from our guests after this next report.
In this Palestinian village in the Jordan Valley, everybody knows everybody. Many of them work the land. Their palm trees almost seem to reach across the border to the mountains of Jordan. Here in the Jordan Valley, the village of Jiftlik is already surrounded by 7 Israeli settlements. But most worrying for these farmers is what happens to Jericho. It's the largest local town, and it would be completely cut off from the rest of the West Bank.
بيهدموا المنازل عندنا، بياخذوا الأراضي، عاملين حصار علينا من المستوطنات، أراضينا كلها ماخذينها، أراضي بجيبتها ماخذينها، المية ماخذينها، بيهدموا البيوت عندنا، بيستولوا على كل شيء. يعني إحنا كيف إذا هسه برا الحكم وإحنا عليهم زي هيك.
Even the Palestinian governor doesn't control much of the territory. As soon as we're here, we're under observation.
زي ما انتم شايفين الجيش والمستوطنين تبعينهم بيجوا بيحاصروا المنطقة. ليش انت جاي على أرضك؟
Israel considers this area to be essential for its security, as a buffer zone in case of attack by Arab states from the east. It's also extremely fertile land in a desert area.
فلسطيني ممنوع عليه انه يحفر ابار ويستخرج مياه من اجل انه يزرع اراضيه، لانه المي هاي ما بتكفي لالاف الدنومات في قريه في مدينه العوجه، وهذه العوجه هي سله غذاء شعبنا الفلسطيني.
Palestinians here say that any annexation, even a limited version, would kill the 2-state solution and the dream of a Palestinian state.
Iris Makler, our reporter there. Interesting to see the villager wearing his New York Yankees baseball cap. Meanwhile, in New York, in his tower, Donald Trump, of course, trying to make decisions and impose decisions that affect their lives. Hugh Lovett, it's easy to forget when we talk about this in geopolitical terms that there are real people with their lives at stake.
Absolutely, and we can talk about sovereignty and negotiations and so on and so forth, but it's not just a question of Palestinian collective and national rights. It's also the question of Palestinian individual rights, and we heard it before, and we've heard it quite regularly from the Israeli government, and now they're actually being very clear and explicit. Is what is on offer to the Palestinians is not a state; it's a state minus. And what's on offer is not, so basically it's given Palestinians the choice between either the status quo and unequal rights, or more of the status quo and more of unequal rights. And so with annexation, what that means practically, as we saw in the report, is the dispossession of Palestinians from their private property, from their land, their fields, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as we have these sort of bigger picture conversations.
Let's go to Tel Aviv. Emmanuel Navon, the situation as we see it, the plan that Trump put forward, Netanyahu really for it. The Palestinians, of course, say they weren't involved, and they're certainly not willing to accept anything within it. Do you think in some way Trump was really trying to help his friend, as he calls him, Netanyahu, with his issues, bring him forward, give him something to cling to, or perhaps set up something that the Palestinians would flatly refuse so they can say once again, look, they've refused again?
Look, I think, first of all, that Trump and his advisors were obviously aware, and David Makovsky correctly explained it before, of the failures of previous U.S. administrations, despite the efforts of President Bush, of President Clinton before him, and of President Obama. And so I think that, rightly so, Trump said, why should I repeat, why should we try more of the same? So he tried something else. So trying something else doesn't mean that it will work. But as I said before, and forgiving me for repeating myself, and again, here I agree with David, the gap is so wide between Israel and the Palestinians that I think we have to think more realistically. As I said before, a return to the 49 armistice lines, division of Jerusalem, etc., and the refugees, it's just not going to happen. So at least this plan, and as I said before, repeats the principles of Yitzhak Rabin from 1995. At least it's acceptable to the Israelis. Now, to the Palestinians, and here I'd like to react to what you said, we're not talking about lesser rights. I mean, a state, even demilitarized, is a state. I mean, you have other states in the world. I mean, Japan for many years was also demilitarized. Not having an army, that doesn't mean you don't have political rights. The Trump plan, if you read it carefully, if it was actually implemented in the real world, it would lead to a demilitarized Palestinian state. And it would be for that state to decide whether it would be democratic and give rights to its population. As we know, in the Middle East, you have many independent states who do not give political rights to the citizens. That's for them to decide. But it is possible to be a state, even with limited sovereignty in terms of army, and yet have its population have the same political rights than anybody else. So the fact that it would be demilitarized, it doesn't mean that the Palestinians would have lesser rights. And last point that I'd like to make, somebody I don't remember who said before, the Palestinians should just submit a counteroffer. I think if the PA and the Palestinian Authority really wants to stop annexation, all they would have to do is to agree to negotiate on that plan, because the moment they agree to negotiate, Israel will not be able to make unilateral moves. The Trump plan speaks about negotiations. And then they'll be able to at least start a process and really stop the annexation process, because annexation, according to the plan of President Trump, can only take place if the Palestinians refuse to negotiate for a certain number of years.
Indeed, and I suppose it's a question of finding the basis for that negotiation. If it's the Trump plan, then that kind of comes to the crux of the matter, why the Palestinians didn't come to the table. Duad, sorry, I know you want to come in. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm inviting you all to pizza, and I decide what's in the pizza, and I start eating the pizza, and then we can negotiate which parts of the pizza you will get. I mean, it's so paternalistic, it's so colonial, it's so racist that you guys, not you guys, Israelis and Americans want to decide the future. Now, there has to be some reference point. You cannot write the Trump plan in Tel Aviv and have it read in Washington and say, why don't you accept it? Let's accept something that we all agree to, the UN, the Russians, the EU. Let's find a partner, including the Americans, that everybody agrees to. So that's clearly not going to work. And the Israelis are the powerful. They have the guns. They have the power. And what happened after World War II was very clear. The world said nobody can take somebody else's land by force and war. You have to actually negotiate. It will take 50 years, 100 years. You have to negotiate. But when you do it unilaterally, you remove the right of each side to negotiate. Now, Palestinians are not against annexation. They're against unilateral annexation. You want to have negotiations, let's agree on the basis, but you cannot tell us the only basis is the Trump plan, which was written in Tel Aviv. That's not fair.
David Ziegler, can I bring you in to respond to that one?
Yeah. Look, obviously, I would like to see it the way Daoud sees it, that we get the two sides. I started with this back together. What my doubt is by saying that our viewers should understand that the United States on 3 times, and as someone who was part of the American team during the Obama years, we wanted to do exactly what Daoud said. And I'm just skeptical that we can achieve, whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast. If I had to summarize it in a sense, I would say this sentence: whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's nothing. And that's something that our viewers have to understand. So I don't believe right now that if we got Netanyahu and Abbas to sit across the table, they would reach a final status, as we call it, a conflict-ending deal. I'd rather take part of this and find ways to give dignity to both sides, to deal with the problems that each side talks about, and make progress there without saying we're going to solve the whole thing. I just don't believe that we could solve the whole thing, because we tried that 3 times now in the last 20 years. I'll just say one thing, and here I differ from Emmanuel, is that, look, the idea of demilitarization, of course, is something that the Palestinians have accepted too. It's not an innovation of the Trump plan. Part of the problem with the Trump plan, in my view, is on one hand, you could say, look, maybe this is needed to tell the Palestinians, we've tried 3 times, and this time you're going to get offered less than more. Then each time you were offered more and more when you said no. I understand that. But on the other hand, when you say Israel will decide who goes in and out of that Palestinian state, Israel will have overriding security in that Palestinian state, then it's the actual essence of its sovereignty that you can understand that Palestinians are not going to be exactly enthusiastic about. So I just don't think the Trump plan is an answer. And I don't think we could just say, okay, let's get them together another time and we'll get a different result. That might be the definition of insanity, as Albert Einstein said. So all I'm saying is, let's find a way we can narrow the differences as opposed to solving all the differences, because we tried that approach. I'll just say this one thing. The 90s was about a Palestinian critique that said incrementalism isn't enough. Let's solve it. And America, I could tell you this for sure, we internalized the Palestinian critique, which was solve the whole thing. And we tried that 3 times. And I just don't know. And the 4th time now was Trump, although I think it's unrealistic. And I agree with Daoud on this. But I don't know if the answer is the 5th time. The answer is something gradual to narrow the differences, to get people to believe again on both sides that this is real and that we want to give dignity to both. That to me is more real world at this point.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Daoud.
I agree with you, David. We need to work on things that we can do. But you cannot rewrite history. You cannot deny that Israel built 700 units while they were in negotiations. That was John Kerry, your boss, said that. I didn't say it. And he said it in the U.S. Senate. You can't deny that the Israelis refused to release prisoners, which they had promised to release. So you cannot deny, you cannot change history and rewrite history to fit your narrative. Your narrative is not actual. You're not being genuine by saying you tried 3 times. The Israelis are the ones who messed up the talks, and you cannot deny that. Now, okay, things are different. Israel is powerful. Palestinians are insisting on a real 2-state solution, not a joke one. That's true. And Palestinians are the weak side. But if you agree that the weak side should take whatever they get because they're weak, then...
I didn't say that, Daoud. I certainly didn't say that. That's certainly not my view. I think the Trump plan is not realistic. You and I agree. We could debate 2014 for a while. I just think we're going to lose the viewers. But I'm happy to do that too. But I'm just saying, I want to look forward. I want something that gives dignity to both. I want to see that the public on both sides believe it's real. I just don't think the public believes politicians anymore,
So
what they
let's stop
say.
the settlements and open up Gaza. Have a road between Gaza and the West Bank and stop settlements. That's a realistic, thing that you were talking about. Building trust. Stop the settlements.
Yeah.
They're against international law. The criminal court is going to say that they're a war crime. Stop building settlements. That's an easy one.
Yeah.
Let's bring in Emmanuel. David, let's bring in Emmanuel for a comment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Emmanuel Navon, a comment on what Duad was just saying?
Well, I agree with Doe that history cannot be rewritten. I believe that we're all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. And I think that the facts are known to all about previous attempts to reach an agreement that would have given dignity to both sides. And I am in favor of giving dignity to both sides, but I'm also in favor of being realistic and learning the mistakes of the past without rewriting the past. And I'll just like to also mention the fact that in that panel, I am the only one who lives in Israel and who has Arab neighbors who are my friends, and I have probably more interest than any of you for a peaceful future for me and my children. And I don't think, and we appreciate the help, of course, we appreciate the help of friends around the world to reach an agreement and a settlement, but we're the one who suffer first and foremost for the absence of peace, and we're the one interested in reaching peace. But I think we need to be realistic and learn the mistakes from the past.
Emmanuel, thank you. Hugh, over to you.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important that we distinguish between means and ends. So certainly we can say that the means of the previous rounds of peace processing and negotiations have failed. And I would also say that the Oslo peace process itself has now well and truly collapsed. So by all means, let's talk about how else we can do peacemaking, and that requires working on the Palestinian side and addressing weaknesses on the Palestinian side, but also addressing cost-benefit calculations on the Israeli side that at the moment tend to weigh towards continuing occupation rather than moving towards deoccupation. But when we talk about the ends, let's be frank, there's really only three ways we can end this conflict. One is a real two-state solution, and we all know what this is because we have these famous final status parameters. We also have the 2003 Geneva Initiative that actually did reach an agreement to a track 2 process. So we know what the characteristics of a two-state are, and we don't need to continue reinventing two states. Now, the other two options, one is equal rights within one state, which obviously has implications for Israel as a Jewish majority and democratic state. But then the third option is, a one-state reality of unequal rights for Palestinians, which arguably is the current reality, and a lot of people will call that apartheid. So I think from the Israeli point of view, to believe that Palestinians can forever acquiesce to the current status quo, in which they have neither the rights that come with sovereignty, nor the rights that come with citizenship in the state of Israel, to believe that they'll forever accept that and not demand more, I think is particularly problematic.
Hugh, thank you. Final word, I think, to Duad.
Yeah, well, I thank you, Hugh. I mean, you said what I was going to say, which is what I discuss every day with my children, because my adult children, they say exactly that, your dad, you're wasting your time on the two-state solution. We can wait, as many years as it needs, but we want equal rights. So, I think Israel has the power, but they cannot force people to do whatever they want. They have to either share the land in a two-state solution or share the power in a one-state solution. But yes, they are, strong, they are powerful, they have America behind them, but they cannot force Palestinians to sign if they are not in agreement. And to be in agreement, it has to be a fair solution. And so far, Israel has not given Palestinians a fair and just solution.
We could continue. There's so much more to say, but sadly, time against us. Thank you, Duad Gutab in Amman. Thank you, Emmanuel Navon in Tel Aviv, Hugh Lovett in London, and David Makovsky in Washington, D.C. And thank you, of course, for watching wherever you are in the world. This is the France 24 debate. Do stay with us.
The world is ever changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what, France 24 is with you everywhere, all the time.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.